Right now, your eyes are capturing nearly perfect detail of this screen. Every word, every pixel, all of it registered. And in about a fifth of a second, almost all of it will be gone. Your brain just threw away a masterpiece it spent zero effort painting. That's sensory memory, and it's the most fragile storage system you own. Sensory memory. In the 1960s, a researcher named Sperling flashed a grid of letters on a screen for a fraction of a second and asked people what they saw. Most could only report 3 or 4 letters. Terrible, right? But here's the trick. When he told people which row to look at immediately after the flash, they nailed about 80 to 90% of it. The information was all there. Roughly 9 or more items stored in vivid detail. It just evaporated in about 150 milliseconds before anyone could read it out. That's iconic memory. Your visual sensory register. A near-perfect snapshot that self-destructs almost instantly. Your ears, though, way more generous. Echoic memory, the auditory version, holds sound for 2 to 4 seconds. That's why you can replay the last thing someone said, even when you weren't listening. Your brain kept the audio on loop just long enough for you to catch up. You're welcome. The wild part is that capacity at the moment of registration is basically unlimited. Everything coming through your senses gets recorded. The bottleneck isn't how much fits in, it's how fast it decays and how narrow your attention pipeline is. Only a tiny sliver gets grabbed and passed downstream. Everything else, gone, forever. So what happens to the sliver that survives? Short-term memory. You've probably heard that you can hold about 7 things in your head at once. Phone numbers, grocery items, names at a party. 7 plus or minus 2. George Miller published that number in 1956 and it became one of the most quoted facts in all of psychology. It's also kind of wrong. Modern research, most notably from Nelson Cowan, puts the real number closer to 3 to 5 chunks. Sometimes as low as 4. The original 7 was likely inflated by people unconsciously grouping items together during testing. So the actual holding capacity of short-term memory is smaller than you think, and it doesn't last long either. Without actively rehearsing information, repeating it in your head, it decays in about 15 to 30 seconds. Gone. Short-term memory is a holding pen, not a vault. Now here's something weird. When you hold verbal information in short-term memory, you're not storing the meaning. You're storing the sound. That's why you silently hear a phone number in your head while walking to write it down. And it's why words that sound similar like man, map, mat are harder to hold simultaneously than words that sound different. Your brain is running a tiny audio loop, but don't confuse short-term memory with working memory. Short-term memory just holds stuff. Working memory holds stuff and does things with it, manipulates it, rearranges it, uses it. That distinction matters a lot. Working memory. So short-term memory holds stuff. Great, but holding stuff isn't that useful if you can't actually do anything with it. Imagine trying to multiply 17 by 24 in your head. You're not just storing those numbers, you're breaking them apart, juggling partial products, and combining results. That active manipulation system is working memory. In the 1970s, Baddeley and Hitch built a model for this that's genuinely elegant. It has 4 parts. The phonological loop handles verbal rehearsal. It's that inner voice repeating a phone number while you scramble for a pen. The visuospatial sketchpad is your mental whiteboard, rotating shapes, picturing layouts, imagining where you parked. The episodic buffer ties everything together and links it to long-term memory. And overseeing all of them is the central executive, basically the manager deciding what gets attention and what gets dropped. Here's what's cool. This isn't just a nice diagram in a textbook. Neuroimaging and lesion studies show these components map onto real brain areas, a frontoparietal network including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and parietal cortex. That's rare. Psychological models don't always line up with anatomy this cleanly. Capacity, still about 3 to 5 items similar to short-term memory, but you're not just holding those items, you're computing with them. Now here's where it gets interesting. We know what working memory does, we know where it lives, but how does it actually hold information? For decades here, the answer was persistent neural firing. Neurons just keep spiking to maintain the signal, but newer research proposes activity silent maintenance, where information hides in temporary changes to synaptic waits between bursts of activity. The electrophysiology data is actively contested. Scientists are still arguing about this one. The what and the where are settled. The how is live research. Think of it like the CPU's registers and L1 cache working together, not just storing data, but actively operating on it in real time. So working memory is where thinking actually happens, but what happens to information after you're done thinking with it? Episodic memory. So you don't just know things, you also remember things that happened to you. Your first day of school, that time you tripped in front of everyone at the grocery store, last Tuesday's lunch if it was weird enough. These aren't facts, they're scenes. Little mental movies with a time, a place, and usually actually an emotion stapled to them. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Endel Tulving gave this its own category and called it episodic memory, separating it cleanly from knowing facts about the world. But here's what makes episodic memory genuinely strange. When you recall an event, your hippocampus doesn't press play on a recording. There is no recording. Instead, it pulls together scattered fragments from across your cortex, sensory details, emotions, spatial context, and reconstructs the scene on the fly. You're basically rebuilding the memory from scratch every single time you remember it. Think of it less like a video file and more like a zip archive that has to be decompressed and reassembled each time you open it. And each reassembly can introduce small errors. Details shift, emotions color things differently, new information sneaks in. That's why eyewitness testimony is famously unreliable and why you and your sibling remember the same vacation completely differently. Fun fact, neuroimaging shows that episodic and semantic retrieval actually light up a lot of the same brain regions, which means the clean line between remembering events and knowing facts is messier in the brain than it is on paper. So if episodic memory is your personal highlight reel, what about all the stuff you know that isn't tied to any specific moment? Semantic memory. So episodic memory is your personal highlight reel, stamped with time and place. Semantic memory is what's left when you strip all that context away. You know, Paris is the capital of France. You don't remember the exact moment someone told you that. You just know it. That's semantic memory. Facts, concepts, meanings floating around in your head with no return address. The brain organizes this stuff through the anterior and inferior temporal lobes, which act as a kind of convergence hub. Visual information, auditory information, language, all these different inputs get funneled together and merged into abstract conceptual representations. If this hub gets damaged, you get something called semantic dementia, where factual knowledge slowly degrades. You might forget what a hammer is or what dogs look like, while your episodic memory stays relatively intact. You remember your birthday party last year, you just can't remember what cake is. Here's what's interesting though. Neuroimaging shows that semantic and episodic retrieval share a lot of the same neural real estate. They're not two separate filing cabinets, they're more like two departments in the same building, constantly borrowing each other's stuff. In fact, most semantic knowledge probably started as episodic memory. You heard Paris is the capital of France in a specific classroom on a specific day. But over time, with repetition, the context faded and the facts stayed. Episodic memories are context stamped. Semantic memories are context stripped, and information migrates from one to the other the more you encounter it. So these categories are useful, but they're not perfectly clean, which is kind of a theme with memory in general. Okay, let's talk about the stuff you don't even realize you remember. Procedural memory. Here's something wild. Patient HM had his hippocampus removed and couldn't form new episodic memories at all. Couldn't remember what he ate for breakfast. Couldn't remember the researchers he'd met dozens of times. But give him a mirror tracing task where you trace a shape while only looking at your hand's reflection, and he got better at it every single day. He just had no memory of ever practicing. That's procedural memory. It's the system that encodes motor skills, habits, and cognitive routines, and it operates completely below conscious awareness. You don't remember learning to type, you just type. People call it muscle memory, but that's not quite right. Your muscles aren't remembering anything. Your basal ganglia and cerebellum are. The basal ganglia handle habit consolidation, the cerebellum handles motor timing and automatization, and frontal cortical circuits tie it all together. Completely separate wiring from the hippocampal networks that handle declarative memory, and the proof goes both directions. HM lost episodic memory, but kept procedural learning. Patients with Parkinson's or Huntington's, where the basal ganglia degrade, lose procedural learning but keep their declarative memory mostly intact. That's a clean double dissociation. Two systems, independently breakable, so that covers the human side of memory, sensory, short-term, working, episodic, semantic, procedural. Now let's flip the entire architecture. What happens when you build memory out of silicon instead of neurons? CPU registers. So we've been talking about human memory, but now let's flip to the machine side, because computers have their own memory hierarchy, and it starts here at the absolute fastest layer. Inside your CPU, there are tiny storage slots that hold whatever the processor is actively working on right now. A single read or write to one of these slots completes in one clock cycle. 1. For comparison, even the fastest cache memory on the chip takes 4 to 5 cycles. These tiny slots are called registers, and they are the fastest memory in your entire computer. Now, most people picture maybe 16 registers inside a CPU. The classic general purpose ones you'd see in a textbook. but modern x86-64 processors have way more than that. You've got general purpose registers, vector registers for parallel math, control registers, debug registers, and specialized ones like the AVX512 op-mask registers K0 through K7. One analysis actually counted all the architectural and micro-architectural registers on a recent Intel core and landed on roughly 557. 557 tiny storage slots, all operating at single cycle speed. Quick honesty check, the architectural registers are fully documented in official manuals. The micro-architectural ones are partly estimated through clever analysis because chip vendors don't publish every internal detail, so that 557 number is well reasoned but not stamped on a spec sheet. Registers are also completely volatile. Kill the power and everything in them vanishes instantly. They're part of what's called the processor's context, which means every time your computer switches between threads, every single register gets dumped to memory and reloaded with the next thread's state. Every tab switch, every background process, there's a hidden register, save and restore, happening underneath. If sensory memory is the brain's fastest, most perishable layer, registers are the computer's version. Blazingly fast, incredibly brief, gone the moment you look away. But registers are tiny. You can't fit much in 557 slots. So what happens when the CPU needs more data than registers can hold? L1/L2/L3 cache. So registers are fast but tiny, and RAM is big but slow. Like really slow compared to the CPU. We're talking roughly a 100 times latency gap between registers and main memory. That's a problem. You can't just have the processor twiddling its thumbs waiting for data from RAM every few nanoseconds. So engineers built a bridge. Actually, they built 3 bridges stacked on top of each other. That's the cache hierarchy. Let's use AMD's Zen 4 as a concrete example. L1 data cache, 32 kilobytes per core, load to use latency of about 4 to 5 cycles. Tiny, but screaming fast. L2, roughly 1 megabyte per core at 14 or more cycles. Bigger, slower. L3 shared across the whole die, tens of megabytes, averaging around 50 cycles. Each level trades speed for size, that's the whole game. But it's not just a pile of memory sitting there. Cache organization is engineered down to the bone. L1 is typically 8-way set associative, meaning it has specific rules for handling conflicts when multiple addresses compete for the same slot. Some designs use inclusive caches, where L3 contains copies of everything in L1 and L2. Others use exclusive designs, where each level holds unique data, and prefetching policies try to predict what data you'll need before you even ask for it. Kind of like your brain loading context before you finish a sentence. Here's the dramatic part. If your data isn't in L3, the CPU has to go all the way to DRAM. That's 200 to 300 plus cycles. You go from a 50 cycle L3 hit to a 200 plus cycle DRAM miss. That's the performance cliff. That's why cache-friendly code isn't a nice to have in high-performance systems, it's survival. The human parallel here maps pretty cleanly. L1 and L2 are like working memory, fast, active, limited, volatile. L3 is more like short-term memory, a slightly slower buffer for recently accessed stuff, small, lossy, and absolutely critical for not stalling out. So what happens when even the cache can't help and you need the big, slow main memory? RAM. So the cache missed. All 3 levels, nothing. Now the CPU has to go out to main memory, and this is where things slow down noticeably. RAM is your system's big working pool. On a modern consumer PC, that's somewhere between 16 and 128 gigabytes of DDR5. Way more space than any cache level, but you pay for that size with latency. A typical DDR5 5600 kit lands around 12 to 13 nanoseconds of real-world latency. That might sound close to L3's roughly 10 nanoseconds at 5 gigahertz, but the access pattern overhead on a full memory request makes RAM stalls significantly more painful in practice. The CPU isn't just waiting a couple extra nanoseconds, it's stalling an entire pipeline. Now here's the thing enthusiasts argue about constantly. JEDEC D, DR5 standard, defines data rates starting at 4,800 megatransfers per second, and vendors sell kits marketed at 6,000, 7,000, even 8,000 megatransfers per second. Sounds fast, but that megatransfer number is the marketing number. Higher frequency kits often run with looser timings, which means the actual latency in nanoseconds barely improves, or sometimes gets worse. The number that matters for most workloads is the real latency, not the headline transfer rate. A kit running at 6,000 megatransfers with tight timings can genuinely outperform a kit at 8,000 with loose ones. Bandwidth matters for specific tasks, sure, but latency is king for general responsiveness. And just like registers and caches, RAM is volatile. Power goes out, everything in it vanishes. It's the last line of fast working storage before your system has to reach for a drive, and drives operate in microseconds to milliseconds. That's 1,000 1,000-fold jump. So when RAM can't hold what you need, things get ugly fast. VRAM. So regular RAM is fast, tens of gigabytes per second, low latency, pretty solid. But GPUs don't need pretty solid. GPUs have thousands of tiny cores all screaming for data at the same time. You can't feed 1,000 mouths through a single straw. You need a fire hose. That's what VRAM is. It's RAM's specialized sibling, purpose-built for one thing: bandwidth, not lower latency. Bandwidth. Moving enormous amounts of data simultaneously, so thousands of shader cores can all eat at once. On a consumer card like the RTX 4090, you get GDDR6X memory running at 24 gigabits per second per pin across a 384-bit bus. The result, roughly 1,008 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That's about 10 to 15 times what your DDR5 system RAM delivers on a single graphics card. But here's where it gets interesting. Data center GPUs, like NVIDIA's H100, use a completely different approach called HBM, high bandwidth memory. Instead of faster pins, HBM stacks DRAM dies vertically and connects them through a wide silicon interposer. HBM3 targets up to 6.4 gigabits per second per pin across a much wider bus, pushing peak bandwidth into multiple terabytes per second. That's what powers modern AI training, those enormous matrix multiplications chewing through billions of parameters. And here's a satisfying counterintuitive detail. HBM actually has higher latency than GDDR in some measurements. GDDR6 clocks in around 20 nanoseconds, while HBM2 can hit closer to 100. More bandwidth, worse latency. The engineering trade-off is real. VRAM is still volatile, just like regular RAM. Consumer cards pack 8 to 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X. Data center HBM accelerators carry 80 plus gigabytes. And increasingly, RAM capacity is the hard ceiling for how large an AI model you can actually run. Now, RAM doesn't last forever, but some memory does. Kind of dream. Okay, everything we've talked about so far has one thing in common. Pull the power and it's gone. Registers, cache, RAM, VRAM, all volatile, all temporary. ROM is where that changes. ROM stands for read-only memory, and it's the first non-volatile type in our hierarchy. The data survives when you cut the power. That's the whole point. Historically, ROM meant truly read-only, as in the data was baked in during manufacturing and you could never change it, period. But here's the thing. Modern ROM is almost never actually read-only. Your computer's BIOS or UEFI firmware, that lives on a flash chip and manufacturers ship updates to rewrite it. You've probably done this yourself. The read-only label describes the original design intent from decades ago, not what these chips actually do today. A common example, the Winbond W2 5Q128J VSIQ, a serial NOR flash chip. 128 megabits, which is 16 megabytes. It communicates over an SPI bus at up to 133 megahertz, and it's rated for about 100,000 program and erase cycles with roughly 20 years of data retention. Those numbers are what non-volatile actually means in engineering terms. It's not last forever, it's lasts this long with this many rewrites, and then it's done. So ROM sits near the bottom of our speed hierarchy. It won't forget your data when the lights go out, but writing to it is slow and you can only do it so many times. That trade-off between permanence and flexibility, it gets even more extreme when we go one step further down. SSD/HDD storage. At the bottom of the volatility stack sits mass storage, the closest thing computing has to permanent memory, but permanent is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. NVMe SSDs on PCIe 4.0 hit sequential reads around 5,000 to 7,000 megabytes per second. PCIe 5.0 drives push that to 10,000, even 14,000. The Samsung 990 Pro, for example, posts about 5.54 gigabytes per second sequential reads and over 500,000 random read IOPS. Latency sits around 10 to 20 microseconds. That's fast. Now SATA 3 SSDs, capped by their interface at roughly 500 to 580 megabytes per second, with latency climbing to about 100 microseconds. That's an entire order of magnitude slower in latency than NVMe, and both have SSD in the name. Marketing is fun. Then there's the hard drive. A 7,200 revolutions per minute platter has an average rotational latency of about 4.16 milliseconds, and seek times under 8.5 milliseconds. That's 4 to 8 milliseconds versus 10 to 20 microseconds for NVMe. Roughly a 200 to 400 times latency penalty. All because a physical disk has to spin and a metal arm has to physically move to the right spot. It's a mechanical dinosaur. It also still ships billions of units because nothing else touches its cost per gigabyte terabyte. And here's the thing, even permanent storage has a measurable lifespan. SSD endurance is rated in TBW, terabytes written. AWD Blue SN570 at 250 gigs is rated for 150 TBW. A Samsung 990 EVO at 1 terabyte hits around 600 TBW. These numbers are defined against JEDEC endurance criteria. Your storage will die. It's just polite enough to tell you roughly when. This video opened with iconic visual memory decaying in 150 milliseconds. It ends with ROM flash rated for 20-year retention and SSDs measured in hundreds of terabytes of write endurance. Every single tier in between is a carefully engineered trade-off between speed, capacity, and how long the data survives. That's the whole stack. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.